Well, Paul Cozy thinks I need no introduction, so I will just start. As most of the students here probably know, on August 9th, I published an op-ed with San Diego professor Larry Alexander in the Philadelphia Inquirer, entitled "Paying the Price for the Breakdown of the Country's Bourgeois Culture." Our piece evoked immediate reactions from the media, the public, and from academia, including groups at Penn and Penn Law. There were blog posts, newspaper commentaries, magazine articles, and interviews. It was truly overwhelming. My talk today is about that response, but also about the academic enterprise itself. How should academic institutions, and especially law schools, deal with dissent, with opinions and positions that some or many in the university disagree with? This talk is not chiefly about the substance of the op-ed, although I will touch on that. And it's not about the broader question of how democratic society should handle dissent, although I think my points do apply to political discourse more broadly, as I say at the end, and I'm happy to address both of these questions in Q&A. As for academia, it is well documented that universities today are dominated by people on the left progressive end of the political spectrum, more so than ever before. So the question comes down to how academia should deal with opinions that depart, sometimes quite sharply, from left progressive beliefs and positions, so-called politically correct views. That's the parlance. The short answer in my mind is this: the only really acceptable response is to refute views one disagrees with on the merits and to explain in a reasoned way, using logic, evidence, facts, and substantive arguments, why certain opinions are in error. Civil discourse of this type is especially important in law schools, which are dedicated to teaching students how to think about and argue all sides of questions. Reasoned argument and informed civil discourse are the tools of our trade as lawyers. They are why we exist. They are what we do. They are why we are here. And indeed, Heather Gerken, the dean of Yale Law School, made just this point in Time magazine recently. Now, our school is also an academic institution, and academic institutions exist to provide a place for people to think and reason about important issues of the day that affect how society should govern and organize itself, to determine the rules we should live by. Universities are not politics, they are not religion. Universities need a variety of views. There should be no orthodoxy immune from challenge in academia. Now, that means that what we should not do at law schools or at universities in general, or we should try to avoid, is to engage in unreasoned speech, hurling slurs and epithets, name-calling, vilification, mindless and casual labeling. Likewise, we should not condemn and categorically reject claims without justification or arguments that try to meet the substance of those claims. Yet these rules have been violated repeatedly in the current climate here at Penn and at other universities. We have fallen short of the academic ideal. Now, one might say, and it has been said, that unreasoned slurs and condemnation are speech. After all, they are just free speech. But this knee-jerk embrace of free speech, of utterances of any kind, is in my mind too low a standard for the academic enterprise. One does have the right to hurl crude words like yuck, ick, xenophobe, hater, and of course the ubiquitous accusatory racist. But that doesn't make it the right thing to do or the right way to go about academic discourse. These tactics do not enlighten, inform, edify, or educate. Indeed, the paradox here is that speech of that type can undermine these goals. Unreasoned and accusatory speech, which publicly blames and shames, results, ironically, in less speech, because it discourages and stifles dissenting voices. Academia's mission, which includes discerning how we should chart society's course, requires a higher standard. It requires hearing, indeed, I would say welcoming and nurturing all points of view in the marketplace of ideas, even those with which we might violently disagree. It requires looking at the full range of evidence and facts, even those that are uncomfortable and inconvenient. Now, I want to turn to the specific responses to the Inquirer op-ed, the good and the bad, what went right and wrong, and the role of your professors here at Penn Law as role models and anti-role models in this saga. And of course, I will talk about the effects of all of this on you, the students at this law school. Well, a lot happened since the op-ed was published. Just to summarize, there was a raft of immediate letters, statements, petitions from organizations like the National Lawyers Guild, a student group, Get Up, a graduate student organization, Drexel and Temple professors, others condemning the piece, tarring it with a familiar litany of sins, racism, white supremacy, hate speech, heteropatriarchy, xenophobia. We didn't get sexism, but I'm sure that would be in there. There were demands that I be removed from the classroom, from committees, from positions of authority. None of these calls even purported to address our op-ed's contention in any serious or systematic way, so they fell short of academic standards right there in my mind. To his credit, Dean Ruger ignored calls to remove me from the classroom, and I commend him for that. However, the law school could not resist issuing an official statement repudiating the op-ed, which in my mind was totally unnecessary since no one thinks a professor speaks for the law school when they express their private views. And Dean Ruger doubled down by writing his own op-ed. In a strange exercise of reverse causation, he linked our piece to Charlottesville, which happened after we published it. And he affirmed that, quote, even noxious opinions, I guess ours included, are a form of free speech, something I hope we already all knew. Did anything go right? A few things did in the wider world and at Penn. First, and importantly, there was a responsive op-ed in the Daily Pennsylvanian signed by 5 of my colleagues that accused our op-ed of bad history in praising the 1950s. Now, it will not surprise any of you that I did not agree with its arguments, but at least it was an attempt to make an argument, and that was fine. Unfortunately, the authors of that piece went on to sign the Daily Pennsylvanian so-called open letter that I will address in a moment. Another positive, there was a massive, truly massive amount of commentary and reasoned discussion surrounding the contents of the op-ed in the media generally, with ordinary people adding thoughtful and intelligent views, almost all of them positive. That was gratifying. We touched off this debate on some key issues of public importance, the role of individual responsibility and behavior in creating a good society, and that was exactly what we intended. Likewise, I also received hundreds and hundreds, now over 1,000 emails from all across the country, the vast majority of them supportive, many substantive, a few critical, but always respectful and thoughtful. I searched for my best messages by putting in the search term 100%, as in, we agree with your op-ed 100%. Many others asserted, quote, you said what we are thinking, but what we are afraid to say. A rather sad commentary on the state of civil discourse in our society. And many urged me not to back down, to apologize, and I will agree with them that dissenters apologize far too often. Finally, a lot of people wrote from many different groups and subgroups in our society across the racial and ethnic spectrum and a number of recent immigrants saying, thank you for speaking out. The freedom to express opinions is what we value and treasure in this society. That is why we came here. Now, what really went wrong, and what I want to focus on here, is the Daily Pennsylvania, or DP, open letter, a letter instigated by Professor Jonah Gelbach of our school and signed by 33 of our Penn Law colleagues. This letter, which cobbled together quotations from the op-ed and a DP interview I gave the next day, condemned the op-ed and my statements and categorically rejected all our views. It then invited the students to report, quote, stereotyping or bias they might experience. The clear implication, of course, being that the person whose statements were being condemned should be monitored for those sins. Most notably, and this is my most important point, the piece contained no argument, no substance, no justification on the merits, no reasoning, and no explanation for why any or all of what we said was in error. It was utterly devoid of argumentation of any kind. Now, we hear a lot of talk about role models, about mentors one is supposed to emulate, people who set a positive example, who serve as a guide to young people. In my view, the 33 professors who signed the letter, what some of my commentators have called the Gang of 33, are the quintessential anti-role models. They choose to condemn without argument. They categorically reject without explanation. Here's my message to you all. Don't do that. Don't emulate them. Don't be like them. Reject their example. Not only are they not teaching you how to explain your position, which is central to your role and your future as lawyers, but it's even worse than that. They are sending the message that that is not necessary. Just condemn, just reject. Don't bother explaining. It's so easy. It's so easy and it's so lazy. Now, many faculty did not sign the letter, and that bears saying. And that is gratifying and encouraging. They are role models in this regard. And two who did sign, Professor Click and the instigator, Professor Gelbach, did eventually post refutations of the op-ed online at a website called Heterodox Academy, a website that I belong to that is dedicated to open academic debate. In the case of Gelbach, it was many weeks later, and I cannot help but note that he devoted more than 15,000 words to a piece that had initially been deemed worthy only of a blanket public condemnation. You can read the postings and voluminous critiques and judge for yourself. But unfortunately, Professor Gelbach saw fit in his posting to double down on his defense of the DP letter as an appropriate response to what he called our hateful diatribe. The commenters on this defense on Heterodox weren't having any of that, and you can read that too at your leisure. But it's really worse than that. In soliciting signatures for the DP open letter, Professor Gelbach stating in his email to faculty that the dean's office and provost were aware of the letter and indicated it was, quote, appropriate academic discourse. I later learned that that reassurance is not quite accurate. Dean Ruger told me that though he knew of the intention to publish the letter, he never actually saw it, read it, or approved the public version. And as for the provost, the office simply repeated the mantra, we're committed to free speech. I was unable to find out who, if anyone, saw or approved it. This, of course, is all confidential. Such not quite honest behavior in soliciting signatures should not be surprising. When zeal and self-righteousness enter the picture, the rules are frequently bent. But there's more anti-role model behavior to come. I here recount to you what two members of our Penn Law faculty said to me about my op-ed that I think is emblematic of how not to talk about disagreement and dissent in an academic setting, and which in each case evinces an all too common attitude that is hardly friendly to dissent. Shortly after my piece appeared, I greeted my colleague, Tom Baker, who did sign the letter, and asked how his summer was going. The response was, terrible. I've had a terrible summer. He looked visibly disturbed. Why? This actually happened. The answer, it's because of you and that op-ed. You ruined my summer. You ruined the law school's summer too, because you harmed, injured, attacked, and damaged our school, the students, and the faculty. You hurt us. And then he walked away. I didn't have a chance to say anything. Now think about this for a moment. First, who would have guessed that a little op-ed in the Philly Inquirer that doesn't even mention a law school would have the power to ruin someone's summer? That is remarkable in itself. But beyond that, seriously, note the rhetoric and the choice of words. Harm, damage, abuse. That is a declaration of enemy status. The targets of those remarks are the sticks and stones that break our bones, that hurt us. And of course, why would we ever keep someone around who ruins our summer, who breaks our bones, who injures, harms, and attacks our students and our school? The answer is, we really wouldn't. Wouldn't we at least try to strip that person of their position and authority, to impose some kind of penalty? This is not the kind of language that encourages, nurtures, and welcomes unpopular ideas. It is not friendly talk. Rather, it is talk that is hostile to such expression, that seeks even to stifle, to punish or banish that expression. At least I think so. My second example is a conversation I had with our Deputy Dean, Tess Wilkinson Ryan, who could not sign the DP letter because of her official position. But that did not prevent her from defending it. In explaining to me why the DP letter was perfectly legitimate and necessary, she said, well, here's the thing. They needed to get your attention. Why, I asked. Well, so you would rethink what you wrote, what you did, the hurt you inflicted, so you wouldn't do it again. The message was clear. Stop saying that. Stop writing that stuff. Cease the heresy. Once again, I don't believe this is a statement that is welcoming of dissent. Rather, the goal would appear to be to discourage it, to banish it from the marketplace of ideas. Both professors are, to my mind, anti-role models exemplifying the profound illiberalism, the outright hostility to opinions of the wrong kind that the unreasoned DP open letter itself represents. Now, what were the signers of the letter actually thinking? I don't and I can't really know. That's the beauty of it. They didn't explain. And maybe they believe they don't have to. Indeed, the lack of collegiality here was truly stunning, and itself represents a breakdown of academic values. Now, of course, the uncollegial evasion was highly convenient because defending a, quote, categorical rejection of all my views would, I submit, be somewhat difficult. That did prove to be the case, and the evidence that it did was a conversation I had with Professor David Radofsky, who was the only one, and I repeat, the only one of my colleagues who came to talk to me to offer any explanation for why he signed the open letter, either before or after it was published. And I am grateful to him for doing that, and I greatly respect Professor Radofsky. In that conversation, though, it took him about 5 minutes to admit that, well, he didn't really categorically reject everything we said. Bourgeois values are okay. And anyway, not all cultures are equally worthy or adoptive. We can think of some that are not. Those were the main points of the op-ed. So why sign the letter, I asked. What's left? Well, he very much disliked my statement the next day to the DP that some cultures are superior, as evidenced by the tendency of global migrants to flock to white European countries. Those statements, he said, are code for Nazism. Well, I state for the record, I don't endorse Nazism. But what are the important points here? First, objecting to one interview statement, even if arguable, even if there's something to that, doesn't justify a blanket condemnation of our op-ed and all the views. That should be obvious. Second, the notion that what I said is code, or as we hear so much, a dog whistle of some kind, is just unanswerable. In this respect, the invocation of code is similar to that familiar rhetoric that is now standard issue and ubiquitous of emotional harm, of injury, of hurt, of insult, triggers and trauma, of marginalization, of exclusion, of being disrespected and demeaned. This kind of talk, which students have learned very well, and of course the media exemplifies it, brings debate and discussion to a halt, and it is meant to do that. Invoking caught and dog whistles like talk of offense are a form of absolute veto, an airtight way to shut down dissident views. Why? They are highly subjective, there is no agreed upon meaning, they're not objectively testable, they're in the eye of the beholder. As the Red Queen famously said in Alice in Wonderland, and I trust many of you have read that book, we can make words mean whatever we want them to mean. And of course, who gets to decide what they mean? The ones with the power, the ones in charge. In academia today, that's the progressive left. But even if we give the whole code argument its best shot, it fails. Even if cultural comparisons have sometimes and historically been used for very evil purposes, and they have, it simply doesn't follow that all such comparisons must be put out of bounds. Such comparisons can sometimes bring important insights, and banishing them altogether impoverishes our discussions of public policy and can lead us seriously astray. Which brings me now to the comments on the DP open letter itself. Comments that were overwhelmingly critical, even disdainful. I can't possibly do better than the ones that actually appeared in the DP, so I will read you a few. Quote, "This letter has no counter evidence, no rebuttal. It's just an assertion that she's wrong, followed by an assertion of their own beliefs. This is embarrassing. Would this ever fly in a courtroom? If this is the state of legal argument among University of Penn faculty, I will hesitate to hire an attorney from Penn." Another, quote, "This letter is an exercise in self-righteous virtue signaling that utterly fails to deal with the arguments so cogently presented by Wax and Alexander. Note to parents, if you want your daughter or son to learn to address an argument, do not send them to Penn Law School, or at least avoid these 33 so-called law professors." Finally, quote, "I am embarrassed for the lot of you. Merely regurgitating the propaganda you spout reflexively at faculty cocktail parties is not the same thing as a cogent argument. It's good that you're all comfortably safe in legal academia because it appears that none of you would make it as a practicing lawyer." And there's plenty more where these came from. I won't bore you with any more. In fact, pretty much all the comments were along these lines. Now, talk about damaging the brand, about injuring the law school and the people in it. I submit that this letter did more harm to Penn Law School than our op-ed ever did or could do. Along these lines, I was also contacted by a number of law alumni, law school donors, federal judges, and others in the legal community, expressing dismay and downright puzzlement, even shock, at the actions of the faculty, the Gang of 33. Once again, this is damage to the brand, and of course, this is your brand. And all I can say is, I am sorry. But I doubt any of the signers gave much thought to that when they put their name to this document. My guess, and it's just a guess, is that they signed carelessly, even wantonly, not even checking the contents. In fact, the letter mentions the First Amendment, which does not apply to Penn Law School because it's private. They missed that day in law school. They were probably thinking, They were probably thinking about their own rightness, maybe their goodness, and perhaps some genuinely believed that they were protecting all of you from the injuries of forbidden opinions. Once again, I am guessing because no explanation was provided, either in the letter or to me personally. But I assure you, they were not doing you any favors. You don't need protection. Quite the opposite. You need exposure. It's exposure to varying views that teach you how to think and how to argue. As John Stuart Mill famously said, the person who knows only his own side knows little of that. Finally, on a more positive note, I want to tell you about one of my colleagues who behaved in an exemplary fashion, a true role model, a heroine of the tale, who can serve as a guide to action. After the DP letter was published, Professor Catherine Struve, who did not sign, sent me a very carefully crafted and lawyerly email explaining how and in what respect she disagreed with the points in our op-ed. We had an amicable email exchange from which I learned a lot, and some of her points actually stick with me. And of course, we remain cordial colleagues. That, I submit to you, is the way it should be done. Professor Struve is your role model. When confronted with disagreement, even with ideas that you abhor or abhor passionately, ask yourself, what would Professor Struve do? And you would not go wrong. Jonathan Haidt of NYU, critiquing the DP open letter on heterodox, echoes that insight. Letters of condemnation, he said, should not be used to respond to expressions of faculty opinion. Quote, every open letter you sign to condemn a colleague brings us closer to a world in which academic disagreements are resolved by social force and political power, not by argumentation and persuasion. He says, when asked to sign such an unreasoned statement, press the delete button, put it in the trash. Now, what are the implications of what I have just said for all of you, the Penn Law students and members of the Penn community? I submit to you that we are now dwelling in a climate of orthodoxy, fear, and intimidation on many vital, important, hot-button issues of the day. Not all issues, by any means, but many important ones. I do not get the sense that students feel free to dissent from approved opinions, and many at Penn and elsewhere have expressed such trepidation to me in person and via email. And they are not just worried about people in authority, but about their peers. The peer pressure, not to utter the wrong opinions or say the wrong things. The Stasi-like atmosphere, that's the East German secret police, especially at the university. And at a university now littered with officers and committees, an entire massive bureaucracy ready to receive student complaints and to guard student sensitivities. Will that bureaucracy ever go away? No, I fear bureaucracies only grow. That students and others in the university do feel inhibited, and justifiably, comes through loud and clear in what students have told me, specific incidents. They recount being called out for sexism, racism, other violations, for making what I regard as innocuous comments, or maybe not so innocuous. Frankly, the problem is getting worse, and many students are tired of it. And who can blame them? But what can they do? The commentary on Jonah Gelbach's defense of the DP open letter on heterodox illustrates, I think, that people at the university, not just students, but untenured, unprotected people, are intimidated by both peers and people in authority. So I am going to read you some of the comments. One person directs his address to Jonah Gelbach. Quote, how do you think a conservative student would feel after seeing you use this prescriptivist definition, diatribe, to defend your condemnation of a colleague? Do you think they would be impressed by the opportunity for academic freedom, open debate, and respect from peers? Another writes, quote, I know a lot of people in science, and they are all scared of you, Professor Gelbach. They know that one bad word from you or your student acolytes, and they are toast. I can only imagine what kind of pressure an untenured assistant professor or adjunct is under to conform. You have established a culture of intimidation. If that was your goal, congratulations, well done. You have succeeded brilliantly. And finally, quote, I am sure that you, Professor Gelbach, and your mob think of yourself as holy warriors, as speaking truth to power. Here's the problem. You are the power. You have absolute power. And like many before you, you handle it poorly. You use it to bully and to shame, not to enrich, ennoble, and enlighten. What do we glean from these comments? It confirms, I think, what I've already said. The dominant culture on campus does not embrace and welcome dissent. Far from it. And we are all aware of the method of stifling and discouragement. Here I am talking about the language and the parlance of a grievance culture, the 800-pound gorilla of a heckler's veto, the rhetoric of feelings, upset, abuse, disrespect, insult, and marginalization that seeks to quell and banish dissent as a way to protect victims. As the political scientists say, the Overton window, the range of permissible thoughts, shrinks rapidly, and it moves relentlessly left. And then there is all the forbidden vocabulary. Undocumented immigrant is the term, not illegal alien. Gender orientation, not sexual preference. Nostalgia for the 50s is hate speech and white supremacy. Praising Western Civ and white Europeans is racism, although depicting whites as murderous ogres is fine. Indeed, even factual statements can get you into hot water if the facts are inconvenient or unwelcome enough or hurt people's sensitivities. Indeed, just for a moment, suppose you had written what I wrote. Can't imagine it, perhaps, but well, go with the hypo, as we say in law school. What would happen, do you think? As John Zimmerman of the Ed School recently stated in Inside Higher Education about the open letter, what happened to Amy Wax can happen to you, and worse. There is nothing stopping anyone from coming after you if you say something deemed unacceptable with public shaming and unreasoned condemnation, and once you are labeled a hater, a xenophobe, a racist, or a white supremacist, that label will stick, and nothing else will matter in this internet age. And not far behind will be calls to action, to do something about that enemy within. And it won't do to hide behind the skirts of tenure, as few in the university have that privilege. So for you, the consequences could be dire. Think of the loss of a law review position, a fellowship, a clerkship, even a job offer. Now, some may reassure you, we would never do that to you. We won't come after a vulnerable junior person. There are guidelines and procedures and committees that protect you. Well, frankly, I do not think those are worth much in the face of a howling mob. The spirit of liberty and tolerance, of open inquiry, does not live in committees and procedures. It lives in individuals, in the hearts and minds of those in charge of the university. And today it doesn't, not enough. The university today has too many illiberals. They may pay lip service to free speech, but in fact are perfectly happy to see it muted or to see it go away altogether if the wrong opinions are being expressed. They are happy to have you stop saying what you're saying. Indeed, I would submit that is their purpose and goal. Why else condemn without reasons? Why else categorically reject? Now, what does the present situation imply for the place of the university in society? Unfortunately, given that there are growing numbers of topics in which one opinion or a monoculture prevails, and we know what some of those are, right? So here I'm talking about immigration, for which Dean Ruger has actually admitted to me there is only one acceptable view at Penn Law. Globalization, nationalism, cultural difference, race, sex, gender, family structure, sexual behavior, climate change. What it means is that on those issues, the university is rendering itself irrelevant, a site of orthodoxy and prescription, a place where people are taught not how to think but what to think. The real debate, the discussion, has moved elsewhere, to think tanks, online, to private clubs. And I know from experience that the quality of debate in some of those places is far richer than here at Penn Law. Finally, we have a situation in which victim groups, both historic and self-defining, and there are many and they are growing in number, have been given virtually absolute veto power over discussion in our universities by invoking these familiar concepts of emotional harm, of marginalization, of disrespect, by invoking codes and dog whistles. That should not be. All people in the community should stand on an equal footing in being obliged to explain and defend their positions, however difficult and arduous that proves. Where does it all end? Where does this lead? Well, why should it end? Indeed, I will be publishing several pieces in coming months in various venues, and given the popularity of our op-ed, I've been invited to contribute more columns to the Philadelphia Inquirer. Stunningly, I'm told that our piece got more hits than any other piece that, I don't know. If the August op-ed was worthy of condemnation, these pieces certainly will qualify for condemnation. So why stop with only one DP open letter? The army of 33 avenging angels could simply clone a letter, swap in a few quotes and sign. They wouldn't have to give any reasons. That's the beauty of it. If heresy doesn't end, and it won't, condemnation won't end either. Now, what advice to you? A few points. Number one, be cautious in dissent. I'm sorry to have to say it, it's sad. I used to tell students to be bold, but now I feel differently. And don't trust the people who encourage you to speak your mind, because in my opinion, their assurances are often hollow. When you comment, don't name, call, slur, libel, or vilify. Don't use those casual ism words. They're not enlightening. They don't advance understanding. When invited to join in unreasoned condemnations, don't follow the negative role models. Rather, remember the positive role model. The right motto is, what would Catherine Struve do? Okay. And as Jonathan Haidt says, press delete. Don't emulate other members of our faculty that I have talked about, people who want you to rethink so you won't do it again, who use the facile, petulant language of attack, damage, harm, ruin, insult, of accusation, of the enemies from within. Rather, embrace the dignified, reasoned language of evidence, justification, argument, the modes of civil discourse that are fitting for those worthy of self-rule and democracy. And realize that operating in the marketplace of ideas is hard work. It requires patience and restraint, investigation and effort. If you're not willing to do that, turn the page or wait for another day. Realize also that operating in that marketplace means sometimes being offended, upset, bruised, or even outraged. Democracy and debate, robust and wide open, are not for the faint of heart. I myself read things every day in the media and from the academy that I find insensitive or offensive or exasperating. I hear insults and half-truths about people I know, my friends, conservative intellectuals. Offense and upset just go with the territory. They're a part and parcel of an open society. They can never be entirely banished. Finally, I recommend bringing principles of decency and restraint, of civil discourse, into the wider world. Yes, you have the right to dislike, avoid, shun people who don't share your politics. I certainly have been on the receiving end of that, right here. Yes, you have a right. But is it a right thing to do? I say, generally not. Certainly not always. It is not good for our society or for our country. We have to live together. We have to solve our problems together. We have no choice. Of course, you will sometimes feel passionate and adamant in your opinions. You will believe things very deeply, and you will believe that other people are wrong. But maybe, just maybe, people who disagree have something to offer, something to contribute to the marketplace of ideas. And of course, the academy should be the place where we hear these people most clearly, where we are in the best position to evaluate what they say. So academic values demand that you do that. And even though you might just be passing through, someone you care about will be a student or a teacher. And certainly we are all participants in society. Uphold these values because they are the most likely to help us find solutions to the terrible problems that divide and bedevil us. Here, Heather McDonald hits the nail on the head. She says in National Review, quote, "What if the progressive analysis of inequality is wrong, or partly wrong, and a cultural analysis is closer to the truth? If confronting the need to change behavior is punishable hate speech, then it is hard to see how the country can resolve its social problems. More broadly, if decent people are not allowed to offer a different theory without being attacked, viciously vilified, then how likely is it that our problems will be solved?" I would like to leave you with one broader thought, and it is this: politics is not everything. To someone who has been surrounded for much of her adult life with people who disagree with her, often quite sharply, and who has lived to tell the tale, I would say to you that you should at least try to find something to like and admire in people whose opinions differ from your own. Even try to befriend a few. They are people, after all, and often people of goodwill. Reach across the aisle. Don't close your mind or heart to those who see things differently. Have we been taught that lesson at Penn Law? Not really. Not really where it counts, which is in the realm of ideas. And if you take that lesson to heart, your life will go better, and so will the life of our country. And I'm sure we all want that. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions and comments. There are some microphones back there if anybody wants to question or comment.
People just want to line up by the microphones.
Hi, Professor Wax. How's it going? I'm curious if you think there are any views that should not be welcomed in the mainstream marketplace of ideas.
Well, I think I'd rather answer that by dealing with specific examples. I mean, here is what I would say about that. I think there are a small number of issues, I think rather than talk about views, I would like to think about issues that our society has settled. And I think the number of those is smaller than a lot of people want to think. So because in a free society, right, we have to deal with arguments and positions afresh and anew in every age. That is just the cost. It is a grievous cost, I agree, of being in a free society. But, I will take slavery. We fought a war over that. Many people died over that. We have written that into our Constitution. It's settled for maybe no other reason that, the anti-slavery side won. I think that, that would be an issue that would not be discussed or worthy of discussion. There might be some others. But once again, most of the big issues in our society, there are, whether we like it or not, and I know many people find it frustrating, there are a variety of views. And that's just the way it is. What's the alternative? Suppression, stifling, becoming more like places where freedom doesn't ring. I think that's a big price to pay.
So Professor Wax, we're both scientists, and we know that anecdotes, cherry-pick comments, they don't hold water. And I can provide you with plenty of anecdotes and examples of people on the left who feel that their voices have been stifled by those on the right in this university. There are plenty of people who I've talked to who feel that there is a diversity of opinions. And I think in your case, you've seen some examples of there being good dissents, as you've cited. So my question to you then is, you're trying to assert that dissent is being stifled. Do you have any systematic evidence that, from a scientific perspective, would prove your point?
Well, I don't think from a scientific perspective that would probably satisfy you. I think one of the problems here, or not a problem, but I think one of the facts about our university is that, to use an internet term, most people are normies. What does that mean? That's a term I just learned. It means that most people pretty much accept the dominant opinions in their milieu and aren't even that interested in thinking that hard about them, which is not a criticism. I think people have other priorities in their life, other fish to fry, okay? So the people that we're protecting are, by definition, a minority. In a place like this, they are. And this has been scientifically documented. There have been a number of surveys of students at prestigious universities, of faculty at prestigious universities, where they are on the political spectrum, what they believe, and they show overwhelmingly that the dominant views are very far left compared to the general population. So I would give you that. I also, fascinatingly, the letters and the commentary that I've read on hundreds now of websites that have dealt with this op-ed, they have been actually pretty positive to this op-ed. I'm surprised, because I know that people aren't hesitant to criticize, right? So I think comparing the wider world and what mainstream views are in the wider world with the views that appear to prevail in the academy, there's kind of a disconnect. And when you've got overwhelmingly dominant opinion, and then you've got these epithets that get bandied about that are nefarious, that people are afraid of, I think you have a formula for suppression.
One quick follow-up to that. You seem to be talking about the general sort of Ivy League environment, but your focus, as far as your talk has been on University of Pennsylvania specifically. And I think you are well aware that you've been given a, well, I'd say reasonably large platform. You've been allowed to speak. You've been allowed to, does anyone disagree with me? Would you not posit that, and you've received positive comments, as you've said, and as you seem rather proud of. So would you not say that this is good counter-evidence to the points that you have made?
Well, I'll give you one reason why it is not. I have tenure, right? I am protected. Now, I would ask you to consider what might happen to me, and you have to speculate, if I had not.
Sure. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Wax, over here. I was a student of yours, so I appreciate you being here and taking my question. I have two. One is, when can we expect a response to Professor Gelbach, as well as the bad history article that's in the DP?
Can you just repeat that a little louder? Yeah.
Sure. When can we expect your response to Professor Gelbach's piece, as well as the bad history piece in the DP?
Well, I'll tell you why I haven't responded. There are a couple of reasons, right? One is I had 4 article deadlines within the past 6 weeks. That is a true statement. So I guess you could say I've moved on to other things. The second answer is that the commentary, the critiques on heterodox of Gelbach's and Click's contribution, and also to the indirectly to the 5 in the DP, have been voluminous. They have been voluminous. They have been cogent. They have been very intelligent, and in a way I would be reinventing the wheel to just recap a lot of the points that have been made. So my view is other people have been doing my work for me, and why should I do the work that they have already done? I mean, that's that's actually the main reason that I've just been unfortunately very taken up with other things, and I didn't anticipate all of this stuff happening. I honestly didn't. And also that other people have done me a great favor, and especially on heterodox, which is academics, and some of them are super intelligent.
Second question, if I may. So I serve as president of BALSA, and during our very first GBM meeting, we spent about 30 minutes talking to students about how they feel about being in your course. And there were some students who said that they felt very afraid to go to your office hours or to ask for a recommendation based off of your writings outside the classroom. What do you say to those students, and why haven't you said anything yet?
Well, once again, I sort of addressed this in my talk. You know, these subjective feelings of being afraid, of feeling bruised, of thinking that, you know, someone is biased or prejudiced against you. I don't think there's any objective evidence for that. When I write letters, I, you know, just go to the mat for my students, whoever they are. I've had several judges say to me, wow, this is a great letter. I don't think there's any objective evidence that they should be afraid to go to my office hours, that they should be afraid to ask me for a recommendation. So I'm shadowboxing here. I'm shadowboxing with subjective impressions, and I think you can appreciate how difficult it is to do that.
My question is just about the op-ed, and I guess since it is about the op-ed, I guess I'll just say that I do think people, if you need to say it, you should say it, but be prepared to defend yourself on either side. And the only reason I ask this question pertaining more to you is because I think that, especially 1Ls and especially people who haven't gotten a chance to meet you or know you personally as a member of the Penn community, that this may be on many other people's minds, even if I could have found it out in a different way. But is there anything that you're doing to directly, I guess, I mean, obviously, you're very much for the public interest. Otherwise, you wouldn't have written this. You want you want to benefit the welfare of everyone in this country. But is there anything you're directly doing to, you know, further that interest, aside from, I guess, writing? You know, that's all I want to know.
Well, you know, everybody has their role in society. Academia is not politics. I could be out there, you know, doing politics, supporting candidates or whatever. I choose not to do that.
Sorry to interrupt. I just mean like directly going into communities and, you know, dealing with these preening pretenses and polemics that you're talking about.
Right.
I mean, obviously you feel very strongly about it. I feel like for me to get to know you more and for other people to get to know you more, I just want to know if you're, you know, doing things like that.
Well, I think your premise here is that, and this is, I think, a very important point. Your premise is that these problems or whatever problems you're referring to or that, you know, we're writing about or that I've written about are problems that outsiders can solve. That is a big supposition. I would actually question that supposition. I am not sure that certain forms of popular activism that, you know, people tend to engage in are necessarily what the doctor ordered here. And I think in some respects, they are actually counterproductive. So that is a fundamental philosophical difference about what works and what doesn't work. I think that's responsive to what you're saying. But I've recommended, I mean, I just published an article in Commentary magazine in which I list a whole bunch of recommendations about what our future direction should be in helping people who are less well off, the so-called forgotten man. I recommend you read it. You know.
But so you yourself, you're not doing anything. That's all I wanted to.
Well, I mean, what would you suggest? Once again, it comes down to specifics.
I'm not suggesting anything. I just.
Well, I'd like, you know, I think we need to deal with all this stuff specifically. That's not a criticism of you.
Yeah,
It's not
thank
a
you.
criticism at all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Professor Wax. Thank you for giving this opportunity to the Penn Law student body. Thank you also for clarifying your position on Nazism. I'd like to just speak to something that you said at the beginning. You said that unreasoned speech is problematic because it stifles the voices that we need to hear in order to have a full discourse. I wonder whether you would acknowledge, as a person of authority, that your unreasoned speech that you engage in the Daily Pennsylvanian does exactly that by stifling the voices that we need to hear and that historically have not been heard at places like this in your classroom. And if you wouldn't acknowledge that that is the real effect of your speech in your op-ed in the Daily Pennsylvanian, I wonder whether you would be interested in, as the champion of free discourse, and engaging in a debate with one of the faculty here that you criticize so roundly for sending you this letter about the effectiveness or the relative merits or demerits of engaging in that kind of hate speech as a professor, and the effectiveness and the effects that it has on the discourse in your class. Because frankly, especially for 1Ls who are in your class and don't have the option to be in your class or not be in your class, it's intimidating to be a part of one of these groups that you criticize. And I think that the real effect is that those people feel like they can't express themselves freely. And I think that in classes where professors are not engaging in that kind of speech, there's probably there's a feeling of being able to express oneself that contributes to a realer, fuller discourse.
Well, I guess I would question each and every one of your premises, right, that I've engaged in unreasoned speech. I would also question, my whole position, right, is that taking a position on issues of public policy and trying to support it, obviously the op-ed is not an optimal way to do that, but taking reasoned positions should not in our society be regarded as intimidating or as stifling counter-arguments. We really need to, I think, get beyond that kind of maybe psychology or discourse that sees expressing certain views as somehow shutting out other views. So it's very easy to say that views are hateful, that they're intimidating, that that people don't feel they can speak up. For every person who says that, there's another one in a different classroom who can claim to feel that way. This is a call to students to digest other people's positions and deal with them by marshaling and coming up with reasons why they disagree, getting past the hurt, past the offense, past the exasperation and the frustration, which many of us feel when we hear views that we don't like. Every time I open up the New York Times, I get exasperated. My children tell me I shouldn't read it anymore. But I mean, my response is not to gin up a letter and get my friends to sign it condemning, Frank Bruni or whoever. I mean, I'm just telling you, I don't think that's the way to go. That's all.
Sure. If I could just follow up once, please, briefly. Thanks for saying that. I just want to follow up on what Nick said because I think that it's salient. There are students in your classes who feel uncomfortable to approach you and probably feel uncomfortable to say certain things in class and feel like if they say the wrong thing in, for example, civil procedure, like I myself did this morning, that they're bearing a greater burden than just what they themselves are bearing. By being a part of this group that's not superior in your mind, they're sort of having to shoulder the burden of everyone in their group just when they're in this class, and that's patently unfair. And again, I want to ask you whether you'd be willing to engage in a debate with either a member of the faculty or a group of students who would be willing to discuss with you what the actual effects are of statements that you, like the ones that you made, on free speech in your classroom. Thank you.
Thank you. Asked and answered, yes.
Thank you. Over here. So, Professor Wax, in your comments earlier, you criticized this statement by the 33 of your colleagues for their reference to the First Amendment, and you suggested that they don't understand that it doesn't apply to Penn Law. In fact, they said the exact opposite. This is a direct quote from their letter. They said, Wax has every right to express her opinions publicly, free from fear of legal sanction, thanks to the First Amendment. And she may do so without fear for her job due to her position as a tenured faculty member at Penn. So when you're so dishonest in your characterization of those who disagree with you, aren't you yourself
being a bad role model for students. And if you're this disingenuous, even when you can so easily be refuted by facts, why should we take anything you say seriously?
Well, the First Amendment would not protect the employee of a private organization from being fired for what they say. And Penn Law is a private organization. The University of Pennsylvania is a private organization. And I would give you the example of Google, right? James Damore was fired for what he said at Google. Google has a perfect right to fire him. Now, whether that was wise is an entirely different question, because reality bites, and maybe he was talking about some important facts, but that's not a problem. They're a company, they're there to make a profit, they have a bottom line. So I think the First Amendment does not protect me from any action by Penn. The only protection
Didn't
I
say
have...
it does. You still mischaracterized their statement. They didn't say the First Amendment protects you from being fired by Penn. They said tenure does.
Okay,
They specifically
tenure
said
does.
They specifically said the First Amendment does not apply here, which is again the opposite of what you accuse them of.
Well, I'm afraid I read it differently. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor Wax. We've never met before. My name is Zach Dunn. I saw you on the street once last year. I wanted to say hi, but I figured, I'd wait for the appropriate chance. So, very nice to meet you.
At least you didn't say I ruined your summer.
No, you didn't. You didn't. I just have a small question. I don't disagree. I think some of the rise of tribalism, political ideology leads to a decreasing and respectful discourse. That's really fair. But do you think if we live in a transmitter-oriented culture, you as the academic writing this with your data and your support, is there any onus on you to, if you know you have a climate you're writing in, to take into account the pressures you're likely to receive and somehow incorporate that into the writing, which I couldn't imagine wouldn't help support your own ideas? And instead of clarifying a lot of your positions, we could have had a debate on just the merits of your argument one way or the other.
Well, there was nothing to prevent that debate from taking place. But I will say this, I am not standing here telling you that you should not think about how you say things, that diplomacy in expression is not important, that rhetorical values don't matter. I am really not saying that at all. And certainly in different settings, different rules apply. So in social settings, I think people need to and should be more cautious about what they say. But in academics, I think there is a great value in being forthright, in being straightforward, in speaking clearly. And I think there are many forces arrayed against that. Forces arrayed against that today in the current climate in a way that make it harder for certain points to be made. So I would say that, while I acknowledge what you're saying, I think there's something to it. I think where we are today, it is important to be forceful because there's so much pressure to trim and to be unforthright. And the points, I think, can get easily lost.
Thank you.
How you doing, Professor? In one of your criticisms of Professor Gelbach's response online, you mentioned that a conservative student here might feel like they're being attacked or that they weren't feeling as comfortable. How do you reconcile that with the kind of dismissal of these subjective students not feeling like they can come to your office hours, things like that?
Well, that's a good question, but I think the way I would reconcile them is that there are actual examples of people in academia today, and those examples are piling up rapidly, of students, for example, an example I just saw of a research assistant at Virginia Tech who is in danger of losing his fellowship and of losing his position for something that he said. I was just told today that an untenured professor at Drexel was fired for something that he said. There are people on the West Coast that I know of, Evergreen State, and there's been calls to fire them. In other words, action is being taken. I mean, it's not just fears. It's not just unsubstantiated fears. Those fears have been, in some instances, realized.
and real quick follow-up. With Professor Gelbach, though, is there any objective evidence that a conservative student wouldn't be able to get the same type of support from him specifically?
I don't have any objective evidence to bring you at the moment, okay? But I do know that, well, I don't want to report things that have been reported to me secondhand. So I will stop.
Hi, Professor Wax. I'm a 1L here, and a couple days ago, many of us, myself included, welcomed our parents and partners here on Monday to sit in on classes and to experience a little piece of Penn Law that was organized by the administration. Your class was deemed students only in a message to some of those people who were planning to attend last week, and the administration said that was because you wanted it that way. Although my understanding is in the past, you have allowed parents and partners to sit in on your class. Could you just tell us a little bit more about how that happened and maybe what your thought process was in closing your classroom, if in fact that was your decision?
Right, well, participation in parents and partners is strictly optional. That's the first important thing, and professors do not have to justify not wanting to be a part of it. I am not a huge fan of Parents and Partners Day. When I was a youngin', we didn't have that. Of course, that's nostalgia. That's not allowed. But in fact, I was responding to the language in the DP open letter about, how students should come talk to faculty members about any stereotyping and bias that they experienced. And I have no idea who would be in my classroom or hearing my class, and what their agenda was and what they would regard as stereotyping and bias. I mean, it could be anything, right? That's the Red Queen problem. It could be any old thing. It's in the eye of the beholder. So I thought that for my sake and for the sake of the law school, it was best if outsiders did not come to that class.
So I'm sorry, just to clarify, when you say outsiders, you're talking about parents and partners of students. Is it accurate to say that you were afraid that if they sat in on your class, that they may be critical of the way you conduct a class in a way that you wouldn't be able to bear? Or that the community wouldn't be able to bear?
Well, given the sort of promiscuous way that we define these sins, it's always possible.
Hello, how are you doing? As an LLM here, reading some of your pieces, I see a hierarchy between ideologies and cultures, and I was wondering what the ultimate triumph of your writings would be. Would it be the obliteration of these supposedly inferior cultures? Would it be the infusion of different values amongst those cultures, or what are you trying to accomplish?
Well, I think you're reading far too much into it.
Okay.
I talk about emulation in my talk, right? I think that people serve as role models for other people. I guess one of my hopes would be that the people who are more successful or behave in ways that don't create problems for others or for themselves, that provide a positive contribution to society, that those people would serve as an inspiration to others.
Hello, my name is Mason Smith, and I'm a 2L. Following on that nice gentleman's point just now, I grew up in an area where there were often conversations about the N-word and white trash, and the substance of the rhetoric around usage of that vocabulary is pretty much the same as the substance of your own argument, but you don't use that vocabulary. So, while I'm willing to accept that your intention in forwarding your argument is your hope that people in these hierarchically distinct groups serve as role models for those in the inferior groups, my personal experience has been that when you use this kind of rhetoric, that is not what happens. It is easier as a person living in society for you to use that rhetoric to make yourself feel better, not to use that rhetoric as a vehicle for your own sort of self-actualization of your aspirations. So while you may be correct in saying that it's technically possible for people to use that rhetoric in a role model sense, I don't think that actually happens. And I'll stop.
Well, first of all, I think it would be a stretch to say that this whole episode made me feel better, right? So I would say that this first thing. The second thing is I have come out foursquare against epithets, against the kind of name calling that you are referring to, right? That would be my second point. My third point would be you are engaging in guilt by association. Now, unless you're specific about the claims that you're referring to, and I think it is important to get specific, what you seem to be saying is because there are some people who use these nefarious epithets, then we all must suspend judgment entirely and completely. We can't make judgments, we can't compare, we can't say something is better or worse, we can't say certain behaviors are better or worse, we can't make any comparisons, we can't give reasons for why we think some behaviors are better or worse. The whole project has to go. And I think that's stretching it way too far. I don't agree.
So if I may follow up, the focus of the conversation is actually not about the usage of epithets. I don't think anyone is calling you out on your usage of the word bourgeoisie.
Plenty of people did.
Well, not in this room. So it's more about the structure of your argument and how that actually is used. And to say that when you use an argument structured in the way that yours is structured, that you run the risk of people abusing that for their own purposes, that's a real risk. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't engage in cultural comparison. I do it all the time. But it does mean that you have to be quite careful and deliberate about how you do that. And I think that that actually speaks also to the point that my dear friend Zach Dunn just made about reasoning extremely carefully and precisely through these types of questions.
Once again, I'm just recapping what I said. The fact that something can be abused doesn't rule out that it can be constructively used. Love can be abused. Love leads to suicide and homicide. Should we banish love? Nationalism can be abused, but it can also be a force for good. So I just reject the notion that because something can be abused, then it can never be used. And I would say to you, I need specific examples. I don't think we can talk about these things as generalities and get very far.
Professor, hello, good afternoon.
I think we're going to end the session because we're...
Can I still ask my question?
But
Can I still ask my question?
Well, very quickly.
Okay. Thank you very much.
People have to get to class.
I am an LLM over here. I promise it will be very, very quick.
Yeah.
Don't you think it's a little bit ironic that on one hand, you emphasize the infringement upon your freedom of speech from the faculty, but on the other hand, you sort of ridicule and use cherry-picked remarks when the gang of 33, as you call them, try to criticize your position?
Well, first of all, they condemn my position. They didn't really give it a substantive criticism. And you're right, that's my point. And you're right, okay? It is a paradox. My talk is entitled Stop Saying That. I am saying stop saying that. Stop saying certain things, which are very low quality speech, because they are going to, under Gresham's law, drive out high quality speech. So you're absolutely right that there is a bit of a paradox there, but I stick by that position. Thank you.